Hi everyone, welcome to the very first episode of my podcast. I'm delighted to have the coolest guest to mark this big moment of episode number 1. The episode that started it all. His name is Maverick Matthews. I thoroughly enjoyed talking to Maverick today. It was like meeting an old friend. He's absolutely charming and delightful. He truly is an exceptional human being, and I don't say that lightly. He walks the talk, he is gracious and a genuinely kind human being, and I'm deeply honored to have him as my very first guest. Maverick Matthews is a non-academic historian who goes down really interesting history rabbit holes. He's incredibly well researched and has so much information at his fingertips that spans interesting and significant parts of our history. Today, we are going down one of these rabbit holes with a very mysterious and enigmatic historical figure known as Count Saint Germain. But before we do that, let me share a little bit more about Maverick. He has his own podcast called Pepper for Your Steak. It's an edgy, cool podcast where Maverick discusses a variety of interesting, thought-provoking topics and ideas. He also creates electronic music that you can find on his website that puts you into a flow state. He runs a camping-based meditation retreat called the Snow Leopard Wilderness Institute, where he uses our connection with nature to deepen our understanding of the self. So anyone who wants to reach out to him, you can contact him at www.maverickmatthews.com. So let's get into it, have fun, enjoy, and let's welcome Maverick to the podcast. Hi, Maverick. Welcome to the podcast. How are you?
Does your podcast have a name?
At the moment, I'm just going to call it Rima Faye Podcast. First, I was going to just have one YouTube. I'm mostly going to be platforming it on YouTube, but so I'm just going to put it on one YouTube channel named after me. But then I thought, no, I want a separate one for podcasts because the content could be quite varied. So yeah, at the moment, it's not very creative, but that's all I could think of because I'm the type of person, I like to talk about all kind of different topics. So I don't really have an umbrella that I could use to basically, categorize it as. So yeah, that's all it is at the moment. And yeah.
So don't worry. In my experience, the kinds of things, these kinds of adventures name themselves,
Actually, that's what I'm hoping, that as it evolves, it will just come, like it will just have its own.
Oh yeah, well. Oh yeah.
Yeah. Well,
thank you for having me. I didn't mean to throw you off right off the bat there, but I realized
cool.
that I didn't know the official name, and I was like, oh shit, let's do this.
Yes, no, it's all good. We want to keep it, authentic and natural. So whatever comes, we just talk about it. So what I was hoping today, Maverick, is that we can talk about a subject that I find incredibly mysterious and fascinating, and that is Saint Germain. So before we dive into it, I'll just give you like a quick intro to how I actually learned about Saint Germain a few years ago, and it was in a completely different context to how you've spoken about it. So when I learned about it, I was quite sort of like, okay, what's this? So when the way I know Saint Germain was there was a time when I was really into, those oracle card decks where you pick a card, it's like a message.
Tarot cards.
Yeah, well, actually, they're not like tarot cards. They're literally just a kind of, but no, they're just a deck of cards where they have a theme. So the one that I had was called Ascended Masters. So each card was basically dedicated to a particular ascended master, ranging from Buddha to Jesus to all the Greek gods and goddesses, and Hindu gods and goddesses as well. So, and Saint Germain had a card for himself as ascended master, and I was taught, I used to use those oracle cards a lot, and in the cards it actually tells you that Saint Germain is the master of violet flame, and that you basically call upon that violet flame, and it's going to purify your energy, clear all blocks and all of that. So there was a time I was like totally trusting and doing things like that. So that was my introduction to Saint Germain, and I actually had a link open, which I'll try and share here. Let me see if I can find it, because it's really interesting. So it's literally that particular card that I'm talking about. So just bear with me. Cool. So I'm going to share the screen. All right, can you see it?
Yeah, I got it.
All right, so that card there, I think that's the exact card. I'm just going to open it. Yeah, that's the exact card that was part of that deck. That deck is somewhere in the house. I just couldn't find it. But see how it says work.
By the way, he had black hair, according to most.
Yeah, but see how he looks very.
I'm just teasing.
Yeah, well, he looks very Jesus-y in that, like Jesus-like in his look.
Well, I mean, that's very waspy, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, very cliche, tropic.
Yes.
But like sometimes those are like the most basic things, and like it's interesting that there's a tetragrammaton in the foreground there. That's what that symbol right there is called.
That Merkaba.
That's called the tetragrammaton. Yeah.
Yeah.
10-pointed star.
Interesting. So I feel like somehow
that's considered the apex of like the spiritual world. That's above the crown chakra. I mean, in the Jewish Kabbalic tradition, the tetragrammaton is like that's God. And so it's funny that they put that in this picture and they made it look very Jesus-like, and they added purple, which is of course, associated with royalty and, all the Christian tradition, they all jack the purple. It's a really interesting picture.
Yeah, interesting. And look at the message, because each of the cards had a message. So the message on this card was work your magic. So, and right. what is he? So I'll let you connect those dots, but I felt like in a weird kind of a way, it actually does come back to what you've discovered about him. So I'm just going to stop this for a second.
That just for clarity, in case anyone's listening and they're going, that's not called a tetragrammaton. That three-dimensional object is also known as a tetractys. That's the more common name for it, a tetractys. Right.
Okay, because I learned to. I've actually got a.
Tetra means 10. That's all that's important.
It's like a cube wedged into another cube, basically, kind of shape.
It's three triangles, I think, and then like one more point. It's an amazing. Yeah. It's an amazing geometric pattern. That's why thinking about people who lived in caves and they could still draw these three-dimensional things seems so basic to us now, but that's because our minds have evolved hundreds of years past that being novel. At one point, cell phones will be considered the same as sidewalk chalk. You know what I mean? Like we will all evolve past that level of knowledge, so much so that it will be considered like the most basic thing for children. People don't look at shapes with any real seriousness anymore, but it's important to note that for the majority of human history, being able to just draw that shape would have made you like the highest of magicians.
Oh, really?
There just hasn't been a distribution of knowledge. Yeah. We forget because we're in extremely abundant times right now. I mean, the Bible wasn't even translated. People couldn't read. They didn't know these things. They'd look at that and they'd be like, that's one of them blooming stars. I don't know what that is. And it's just like,
I like that.
We're extremely lucky to, anyway, I don't know where I'm going with this, but
no, it's interesting actually about the shapes. I know it's a little bit of a tangent, but when you said that, one of the things that came to me is that all the architecture that we built in the last century or from mid-century, see how it's all boxes? Like it's, they've
oh yeah.
Yeah, it's very AI. It's very
well, it's Saturn. It's all cubism, This this is a long tangent, but I can summarize it kind of briefly. I believe that the celestial bodies have an influence on us. And I get this not from my own thinking, but the esoteric mystery schools teach us that each celestial body has a particular influence on you. We as a species tend to acknowledge the moon influencing us on the water plane. Women in 28 days, men in 23 days. But most people won't go farther than that. They won't say like, oh, well, but the sun influences this gold and the moon influences silver and the, Jupiter, Saturn, It all comes together to create like a rhythm. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense.
And sometimes you can get all these rhythms to crescendo at the same time. and that's what like the use of cosmology and like alchemy is, right?
Yeah.
And so bring it back to like the Count of Saint Germain.
Yes, so take it away, because I feel like what you discovered about him is completely in contrast to what I just showed you. So I thought there would be a nice.
Well, how is it in contrast? I'd love to know. I want to hear you say that first.
As in what the contrast is, or?
Yeah. How do you feel it's different?
Well, it's different, but not, because I felt like, the fact that we were just discussing how the message on that card is about magic, and I think that's what he was known for, from what we're going to talk about in a minute. So there are
what
parallels.
is magic,
Yeah. Well, what is magic? Yeah. Like, to me, magic is anything that we don't understand the science behind how it works.
Well, you see, it's interesting. I have a different definition. For me, magic is man's methodology for interacting with things which we have like right now, have a very young vocabulary for. And so like we can do these set of steps which reinforce this idea in our mind to believe in something, and then it ends up it has a higher percentage chance of coming true, right? But we can't even tell ourselves why. We can't explain why that is necessarily. We just know that if we do the set of steps, it tends to have a higher chance or percentage chance of coming true. This is what we call this prayer in some senses, right?
Yes. Yeah.
But it doesn't, there's different kinds of magic. Magic is kind of also a shortcut, because if I could just think about something all day long and it would also eventually come true, but by doing physical things to increase my focus, it's sort of like adding music when you go and work out. You're going to go lift weights or go running. How much better is it if you put some headphones on and you have music in there, right? And so if you can intensify the nature of the experience, you believe it more. We refer to this medically as the placebo effect, and I think that is a disingenuous I think that really diminishes the value of this incredible power, and that is that you can overthink things in a positive way. You can overcome things through thought.
Yes.
In fact, I don't think you can overcome anything without thought.
Yes.
And so that layering becomes a kind of skill. And then what if you could teach a person a kind of layering that got so high that he began to vibrate at such a level that like maybe he was impervious to like illness. If he was really disciplined and he didn't drink and he never took his meals in front of other people, which meant that he had an extremely strict diet, and you maybe was doing a kind of meditation that we don't know about, stretches, oxygenating the whole body. I believe only one of the potentialities, excuse me, only one of the potentials of Saint Germain was that he had managed to perfect his physical experience in such a way that it prolonged his life. I think he may have had some kind of genetic advantage because he came from a background and history of Transylvania, and we know the rumors about that place.
Yes.
And so that makes it a little dark and weird. And then on top of that, we have the idea that now we know that one of the most highest levels of esoteric principles in meditation, whether it's Eastern mysticism or like Thelema or any of the dark left-hand path esoteric mysticisms, the idea of removing your soul from your body is another incredible potentiality that the mystics talk about. I don't know if this is real or not, but imagine if you could remove the soul from the body at the time of death so that you didn't have to die with it. And then maybe you could just reincarnate in another body and you would have like a persistent narrative and you wouldn't have to give up all the information when you died. Those are two possibilities for like who Saint Germain was.
Yeah, that's right. And it might look like on the surface that the side of him that's Transylvanian is somehow contradicts his ascended master status, so to speak, but maybe it's life is not black and white, as we know. So
well, I think the game of telephone is pretty tough too. When you hear especially anybody who knows the narrative about any famous person now, they automatically go, well, that has to come with caveats. Bill Gates is a dark person. Epstein, we all know about. We don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I mean, like there are things happening around us where we see that there's like a a spectrum of the kinds of people that populate the world. And some of them don't necessarily have human interests at heart, and some of them do. And in the interest of Saint Germain, we're talking about a person who was involved in the same Masonic lodge, who orchestrated the French Revolution. And at the same time, he was friends with the French monarchy, and he was telling them, hey, there's a revolution coming. You guys need to change your ways. And they wouldn't change their ways. So like, we're talking about a kind of a benevolent person who was playing both sides, but not on the bad way. Not where he's like selling weapons to both sides. He's trying to like help them work it out.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, like another really famous possible Saint Germain sighting was at like the creation of the Great Seal of the United States, when Jefferson and Washington were in, you know, the garden. I think it was at Mount Vernon, and there was all these delegates there. They're trying to design the Great Seal, and this like stranger shows up, and he's like, "Do these things," and they just kind of accept it and move on. This speaks to the idea of individuals who come into society to seed ideas from time to time in a positive way.
Yeah. So perhaps that's a good place to start for listeners who are not familiar with this, so we can build the trajectory of Saint Germain. Perhaps we can start from, you know, what was the first time in history that we hear about him?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, he spoke of events leading back to almost the time of Pythagoras, you know, so that's like 600 years before Jesus. And so it's hard to know which characters were even the same potential entity. I mean, we're really delving into a realm that is extremely gray. So it's really impossible to say when he showed up. But we know that he talked about being present at the Council of Trent, Council of Nicaea. You know, we're talking about a person who potentially seeded history for like 2,000 years at least. And there is evidence by his own word that he would take breaks. He'd say, I'm really tired. I'm going to go to Nepal and I'll return in 80 years. He'd stay in Nepal by name, you know, and he'd go there and to this place called Shambhala or Zanzibar, Xanadu, like this mythical valley to regenerate, you know.
Which kind of connects a dot between, you know, his how he's seen as an ascended master by the New Age movement, as being, you know, this really wise, highly evolved, potentially ascended master, like, you know, on the same level as Jesus or at least Buddha. So it sounds like he had like a place that he could disappear to in Nepal and hang out with the other, you know, ascended masters. I mean, that's what.
Well, if you study I just went to Nepal a couple of years ago, and one of the reasons was I was super interested in the Yeti. But another thing I was super interested in is like one of the things that if you study the secret history of the esoteric mystery schools, you find that some of the descendants of, and perhaps even some of the survivors from Atlantis, supposedly ended up in the very high areas of Nepal. And this was out of a perhaps I don't know, a fear of the lowlands, because that continent supposedly just like broke up and sank. And so maybe they wanted to put themselves in the highest parts of the world. But you do hear that that there was a breakaway society up in the highest parts of Tibet and Nepal, and that a lot of really sacred high level esoteric knowledge was kind of like stored away there. And he could have been, it's totally possible that he was a being from this previous time when, you know, when the world was very different. Perhaps we all communicated in a different way through ESP. We had much longer lives. Who knows how it was, but it has since changed. And, you know, maybe he made sojourns out of it to seed the world in a positive way. I like that. I mean, it's pretty cool. It's pretty fascinating.
It is. I just find that to me, he's like one of those characters that he doesn't fit the, you know, he's not black and white, basically. You know, he's got all these interesting and mysterious appearances that he's had through, you know, history, that it's hard to sort of really place him in a little box. So he almost defies any kind of real inquiry in that sense, like where you can reach a conclusion exactly as to what he was and who he was and what he was up to. And I find that endlessly fascinating. And Yeah, and one of the part that I really find interesting is that he's got that, was it in the 1700s where he was I'll let you talk about that, but you know how he was sort of courting the rich and the famous. He appeared out of nowhere, was really wealthy, and just was charming, multilingual, you name it. This guy had.
I mean, he could play multiple instruments. He wrote piano concertos. He wrote, all kinds of music that's actually on display in the British Royal Museum to this day.
Really?
And that's pretty crazy that you can you can go see this stuff.
So just like pages of notes,
of music. Then they're like, yeah, Saint Germain wrote this. I mean, we actually have a book that is credited to him. It's an incredible little book. It's printed in a triangle, and it's called The Most Holy Trina Sophia. Now that word Trina Sophia, if you break it down, Trina, Trinity, and Sophia, the word Sophia in Greek, or generally in esoteric knowledge, is taken to mean wisdom. So Trina Sophia means the most holy trinity of wisdom. And this is like a book that you can find a translation of online. Probably it's on sacredtexts.org and a bunch of other locations, but it's very difficult to understand what it means because it's in a kind of deep sacred code. And every major religious group will tell you that you can't just hand out the most sacred knowledge. And the idea that like this dude wrote down what he thought was important, but it's absolutely confounding and confabulating to the layperson is.
So who wrote this book? Did he write it?
Saint Germain wrote this book. Yes, it is credited to the Saint Germain. Yeah.
And so is this Saint Germain? So is this the Count Saint Germain of 1700s that we're speaking of?
Because so let's go. Okay, so like this, because we have so many different potential incarnations of this character, up to the 1970s dude.
Yeah.
The majority of history regarding this character goes from like the late 1600s to the late 1800s. And so that's the most concrete evidence we have for a single individual living a life longer than 200 years. And so because he shows up in court at least 40, but probably he says he's 60 or 70, and he's probably exaggerating. And then he's in court for more than 120 years. And then he appears in Russia and Germany and all these different places. Not like he showed up at Joe's Crab Shack. I mean, like he was in the royal court of all these places. He's in the official documents of the royal court of all of these places. And it's just and the description of him is identical. He says he's the same person. He takes different names.
Yeah.
Like the Graf Traukozy in Russia. How could you even say that name? But it's like, but it's the same person. And he even says, he admits to different people it's the same person. It's in their journal. We have these journals. And so we have like a real cohesive version of like at least one portion of this dude's life. And he was present in Ingolstadt, Bavaria, or not Ingolstadt, in I can't think of the name, in Germany, where Adam Weishaupt was. He was in the exact same town when Adam Weishaupt was rebirthing the Bavarian Illuminati. He is in America when around the same period in the 1776 when Jefferson and Washington are giving birth to our country. I mean, it's kind of it seems impossible, but then we have all this evidence and all these people who had first-person relationships with them, and they're the most important people on the planet. It'd be like as if Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev and like, I'm trying to think of a bunch of old leaders so a lot of people could at least remember and identify them, but like I'm terrible at this. Imagine all these old world leaders were friends with this one particular dude. You wouldn't say, oh, that person never existed, because nowadays there'd be pictures and there are portraits of this man. We have his artwork. We have his poems. We have a book he wrote. I mean, there was a person. You know?
And we know that famous painting of his is from that. Was it from 16?
He's got many paintings.
Yeah. But there's one that's quite famous that appears when you Google him. That appears a lot. He looks like a not Renaissance, but from Marie.
Well, he looks a lot like Weishaupt, and he looks a lot like Washington.
Yes, actually, that's true. So a couple of questions with what you just said. First question is like, because he is also a being that's been potentially reincarnated through the eons. But which incarnation is where he's first known as Count of Saint Germain? Because there's a bloodline.
That's a great question. That's a great question. Okay, so let's clarify that. This person came into the modern, I guess, observation because of the period between around the late 1600s, around 1690, to the late 1800s. And this particular individual was the illegitimate son of the last heir to Transylvania, which is a part of Europe which was eaten essentially by Hungary and Austria, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and maybe Germany got a little bit. I'm not exactly sure, but this region was always very dynamic. And of course, nowadays, it's not the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Those are different countries. And the whole region is still a little bit dynamic. But in that time, Transylvania was a region that was fighting for its life in terms of the ruler wanted to maintain it. This is like his father. But he simply couldn't do the right things politically to maintain Transylvania as its own entity. And so it was taken over by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire, and dissolved essentially. But he, as an individual, as the son of previous royalty, was given to Gian Gaston Medici, the last of the Medici family, the Grand Duke of Tuscany, to be raised. Now, this immediately merges him with an incredibly fascinating line of people, the Medici, which is a banking family from Florence, Italy. And of course, we've heard of these people because they were a dominant power for a long time. So the very last of that empire, supposedly, and I don't think they disappeared, I think they went underground because they weren't ignorant, they just didn't want to fight surface battles. And so they faked their demise, but that's another story. This person raised the last illegitimate son of the last monarch of Transylvania. Okay, so Transylvania has its own set of rumors. We know about all the crazy vampire stuff with long life, all that.
Yeah.
It's impossible to know where exaggeration starts, but we do know about Vlad the Impaler. We do know about some crazy history there.
Yeah.
But there's a game of telephone going on. It's ridiculous. So who knows? What we do know for sure is that this person was raised by the last Grand Duke, and he was schooled at very high level schools. And he wasn't given a title. And so he took the title of Saint Brother, Saint Germain. And it was kind of like a spoof on the fact that his brother and his sister, who were of legitimate birth, Duke Rakoczy was the name of this family, if you want to look it up. Rakoczy. Yeah. And his brother and sister were given official titles, but he was not. And so he took on Saint Germain as kind of a spoof, because he was like, well, I'll just be the people's brother.
Yeah.
And so from there, he all of a sudden shows up. Not much is known about his youth at all. We know kind of like generally what he did and where he was schooled, but all of a sudden he shows up in court in the French aristocracy. And actually all around the world. It's kind of crazy. It would be impossible to summarize every move of this guy's life, because it would take, this is a man who made so many moves that kind of blows your mind. And then that's when people start to question whether or not they really happened, you know?
Yeah.
He appears in Russia, he appears in Germany, he appears in France, he appears in England. He's in England and he's back in France and he's over here. And you're like, a person of means back then could absolutely have done those things.
Yeah.
But to befriend the top of all the aristocracy and hang out with them, supposedly he had an education in India, and this is from his own mouth. Several times he traveled the world and he went to the East to study alchemy, and he learned how to melt jewels together. And this is where he derived his fortune. He supposedly could melt diamonds small diamonds and create bigger diamonds. Which, if that were true, if you could actually do that, diamond dust is pretty cheap, and if you could actually make diamonds out of that, you could really amass quite a fortune. Or if you could take smaller diamonds and make massive diamonds, the difference in price, you could really amass a fortune. And there's a really famous story from Louis XIV having this flawed diamond and giving it to him as a test and saying, like, well, if that's true, can you remove the flaw from this? And he had his jeweler's weigh it and everything before he took it away. And he brought it back a month later, and the flaw was gone, and it had only reduced in weight, like barely noticeably.
Yeah.
But the flaw was gone, and all his court jewelers assured everyone that that was the same piece of jewelry. And that's a really famous story, well documented in court records. So that's supposedly where he derived his fortune.
And then the title that he gave of saint, is that the title he gave himself to say that he's a piece?
Yeah, it was meant to be kind of ironic. Yeah. Because his brother and sister were given titles, and I think he was playing on the idea that, like, what is a fucking title? I mean, so it's fake anyway. It's just like it's currency. You know, it's just we all agree that it means something, and that's it. That's it.
Yeah, but it's interesting that it actually lends itself quite nicely to the idea that he's an ascended master as well, because, you know, the word saint kind of.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Oh, well, he's no dummy. He didn't choose devil, Jermaine.
Yes.
Propaganda and word play and word war has always existed as a component of society. So
yeah. So because he's got that Transylvanian royal blood that, you know, is obviously linked to Dracula and the story of, you know, the whole Vlad the Impaler. So it's interesting that that is an aspect of him that you wouldn't automatically assume equals ascension, so to speak.
Well, it's possible that he intentionally incarnated into that family as like a ruse also, because they'd been so bad previously.
Yeah.
You know, if you believe in intentional incarnation and you believe in ascended masters, you know, they could pick families that would be ironic.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, to me, that seems like very ironic to pick a family that was known for long life, so that people would be like, why does this guy keep living so long? But at the same time, he's the nicest person we have in court. Everybody loves him. He's never crossed anyone. Yeah. You know, all these accusations of him being a charlatan and a knave, it's never of him like dueling anyone. It's never of him attacking anyone. There's never any records of that I can find anywhere.
Yeah.
He's never aggressive, ever.
Yeah, and if you lived if you're an immortal and you lived a very long life, you know, I would assume that you would get over petty things like that. Like, you just want to live life on a higher.
Well, if you're here to actually get something done, you know that stuff is in the way.
Yes, exactly. It's in the way. It takes up your energy. So yeah, I would think that if you've lived for eons, that, you know, naturally you would be like, humans, you know, doing their human thing again. I don't want any part of it. But yeah, so but there is that interesting story about him where, you know, he's in the court, like he's at this court where, you know, he's hobnobbing with the rich and famous, and he doesn't eat. He's always seen holding.
He never eats in front of people.
Yes. So you tell us about that, because that's very interesting.
Well, I've been fascinated by this because I don't believe in breatharians, and I don't believe that there's, you know, any normal human beings that can survive by not eating. You know, you hear these things that people claim, but when they're put up to scrutiny, even David Blaine will tell you that what he's doing is magic, and starvation. And so I don't believe he was starving himself. I think he had, and this, I've tried really, really hard to figure out what he did eat, because wouldn't you like to be a part of that diet? You know, but I can't, there's no record. And I think, well, what it is if there is a record, it's in private libraries and nobody wants to tell you. You know, the Vatican knows this shit. If in the Vatican library, there's probably a book somewhere from some family's private library, you know, Madame Pompadour, Louis XIV, someone who knew what he ate because they were a confidant of his, and he shared the secret with them. Because he did say multiple times that he did have the elixir of long life to certain people, and he did share it with certain people for certain periods of time, which did give them an extension in looks and vitality but didn't necessarily extend their life because those people's lives were extinguished by revolution, etc.
Yeah.
So we don't know what he ate. I would love to know. I'm told the only accounts we have say something like it was a very simple diet. Great. What is that?
Yeah, that could be
a simple diet back then,
Yeah.
And we do know that he supposedly never drank any alcohol, but he dined alone. So we don't know what he did privately. It could have been blood. I hope not. But there weren't a string of murders that followed him around. You think people would notice?
Yeah. So. But that's what makes him very fascinating as well, because there is that connection to that perhaps he was a vampire, given the Transylvanian connection, and how he was seen always holding a drink, and that could be, and he was just sipping at it at a party for a long, that's all he did basically. So it does definitely make you wonder, and I think it's very interesting. Like, I'm not tethered to the idea that Saint Germain was this
what if you felt like pardon the interruption, but like this just occurred to me. What if you were a vampire and you felt like the only way to balance that out was to seed humanity with knowledge because you felt guilty?
Yeah, exactly. And who's to say that? See, this is what I believe. Okay, I believe that vampires do exist, just like any other fantastical beings that we hear about in our stories, our fairy tales, mythology. I feel like they all either existed or they're still amongst us. But the question is not whether they exist or not, including vampires. The question is, are they here with us physically, and they're just underground, living, like walking amongst us, but we don't know about them because they just look like us pretty much, unless they go in the sun. Or are they interdimensional, that they're not really physically with us here, but they can, transport themselves interdimensionally, so we can encounter them and at their, choice, and they can appear and disappear, kind of thing. So that's where my mind is at. That I wonder if he was a vampire, because there's enough, there's enough stories around him that kind of suggest that maybe he was. So let's consider that possibility. So let's say he was he interdimensional, and was he just like appearing and disappearing, and that was just like, I'll help humans, they need help, so they've been doing this, going round and round in circles for too long, so let me help them out this time round. So he kind of just popped in, popped out.
Have you ever heard the phrase absolute power corrupts absolutely?
Yes, I have.
And I don't believe that any sufficiently advanced species that could dominate any other species, it like automatically has like an innate respect for them. I think they begin to view them as less than a kind of toy, a kind of mouse to be played with, and certainly not something they need to factor into like the outcome of their daily life. I think that's the penalty for potentially for being immortal, if that's something that can happen. What I think happens to you is you see these human beings making stupid decisions over and over, listening to authority, becoming slaves. It happens in every epoch throughout history, over and over and over. And I think a divine, not necessarily divine, but like a being who was potentially above human might look down upon that and say like, well, these guys are pathetic, and not really give a shit. That's if you study nature, every being that is above the next being in the order of the pyramid of, life, all the way up to shark or whatever's at the top in the material realm in whatever region. But I think that continues to non-corporeal beings, spirits, things in the afterlife, but nothing really respects what's below it. It doesn't go, a shark doesn't look at his prey and go, well, let me seed some information to these guys. Yeah. I mean, he doesn't give a shit about the fish. He's just going to eat them. And so that's what makes the idea of a vampire really interesting, because it's a kind of being that is potentially part something it uses for food.
Yeah.
I don't know that anything else like that exists, where it's actually part of what it uses for food.
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea to play with, because what kind of empathy does that then generate within the thing because it's eating what it is.
Mm.
You know, it's kind of a cannibal in a sense.
Yes.
Right.
But the way I imagine it to be, if, you know, if that was true, that, you know, vampires would just be like any other species, you know, or race of people, where, you know, you have really good people and you have really bad people, and then you have people in the middle. So, you know, unless you are an ascended, truly, like, you know, ascended to a level of where you've fully enlightened, I feel like there's always shades of gray. So I imagine that there'll be some vampires who are like, they just take what they need to survive, but they're not on a, you know, killing rampage like you see in the movies. So there'll be the good and the bad and the ones in the middle. Like, that's how I imagine.
There would have to be self-loathing vampires too, that just like felt guilty and they hated the fact that they got trapped into the system. And so they were like, well, I'm going to be the different one, the saint brother who actually helps humanity, instead of considering them to be a bunch of dumb rabbits. Yeah. And that could be his whole angle, you know.
Exactly.
Fascinating to think about.
Yeah, that's and so then that leads us to how he's appeared and disappeared. That, you know, he's pops in and out of our observation, so to speak. So, you know, he was also there was also another man who claimed to be Saint Germain in New Orleans. You know, there was an incident there that you talked about, the way it sounded like a full-on vampire encounter.
Well, if you actually study up on that incident, it's, even without the whole Saint Germain lore, it is an incredible incident. And it's not the only one in New Orleans that is like horrific and ghoulish and, you know, incongruent with the rest of our reality in terms of how we process what the spirit world is and what people are allowed to get away with in this realm. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of really crazy things around the planet right now in terms of expression. And maybe we're going to go back into a time where we're like, oh, that was a vampire. And, you know, we had that stuff in Miami a couple of years ago where people on crazy methamphetamines were like eating people's faces. You know, these kinds of like outbursts sort of happen around the world in different times. And in New Orleans, around the turn of for a long time, multiple periods, it was just really crazy, you know, creepy down there, but especially the 1800s. And this dude shows up down there. He, you know, he says he's someone famous. He throws real big parties. He's never seen eating. It all fits all the narratives. But then there are so many vampire narratives of that period in New Orleans. It all fits those too. And then some crazy stuff happens and he disappears, you know, and you have multiple narratives in New Orleans where dark people do crazy things like that. Yeah. You know, but this one particular one called himself Saint Germain and was like, and I'm here too, partying. Let's get this on. And so that might have been, I believe that there's a time in New Orleans history that was a confluence of these type of beings. Right. And they all kind of went there. And that's where we get the movies like Interview with a Vampire, which is amazing. Yes. And all those vampire stories. But like those are all built in some real dark, maybe it was hysteria. But I don't know that it was. I mean, these things pop up. All of a sudden, Saint Germain's there, like, and he's tied to, you know, the Rákóczi family, which is the heirs of Transylvania. I mean, how many coincidences can you overlook? I mean, how many becomes too many? Exactly. You know, and then you're like, well, maybe this is a time when they were kind of like having a festival down there or something.
Yeah, and I'm a believer that truth is stranger than fiction. So we often are very quick to dismiss anything that sounds extraordinary. But what if extraordinary is how we really are? If our world is extraordinary and full of magic and different beings and, you know, and we've all experienced, you know, whether it's through meditation or having visions or astral traveling, that, you know, there is something beyond the world that we can, you know, see with our experience with our five senses. So but New Orleans is a very interesting place. I mean, I've never been there, so I don't know. But my idea of New Orleans is, yeah, like you said, in movies like Interview with a Vampire, and also, actually, that was a scary movie for me because, but that was the first movie that I watched, and I don't really watch horror movies, but I watched it because, you know, Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, Antonio Banderas. What's not to love?
It's like it's a hunk. It's a movie of hunks.
I know, right? They put them all in there. So I thought I'll watch it, and actually, it really scared me. Not because of the graphic nature of all the killings and stuff. They're hard to watch, but it was the fact that the movie almost made me believe that it was true, that they did exist. And I swear I couldn't sleep for a whole month after watching it, because in the movie they show that vampires just suddenly appear. Like they move so fast, like at the speed of light, that suddenly every time there was a shadow that moved at night, I would be like, oh my God, there's a vampire there. Anyways, I couldn't sleep for a month, and then I got over it. But yeah, that movie was so well made that actually almost made me believe that they're real. But now I actually think they are real, and just like any other beings that are also mystical or fantasy creatures that we don't they're a part of our mythology or a part of our fairy tale folklore. So but New Orleans, it was also actually shown in that it was a setting for that the Originals, a vampire TV show that was
I never saw it.
Yeah,
I've heard of it.
Yeah, it was a spin-off from Vampire Diaries. So it was called The Originals. So basically there were the original vampires, and it was all set in New Orleans, and it was basically they had everything, werewolves and witches and vampires all living side by side and having that infighting in New Orleans. So you're saying that there was a time in history when this person who claimed to be Saint Germain popped up, that was like a big part of that scene back then.
Well, the history of New Orleans is fascinating because the Haitian Revolution was essentially what got us the Louisiana Purchase. And the Haitian Revolution was a bunch of Haitian slaves rose up and killed their French colonial masters. And so France lost Haiti as a colony, and that basically destroyed around a third of their gross domestic product. And that was like too big for them to handle. And so they sold America the Louisiana Purchase. And so we purchased this huge piece of land for nothing. And it became kind of this backwater of the country because we weren't really sure what to do with it or why it was valuable yet, but it ended up being an amazing seaport. And New Orleans is famous because it's at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which goes all the way up into the country. And as the country developed, it became, the basic port where things started to go up into the country. And so that's why New Orleans is important. The French Quarter in New Orleans is I don't know how many blocks it is, but it's a zone right on the Mississippi River, which is a few feet higher than the surrounding area. And so like when Katrina came in, the hurricane that destroyed a lot of New Orleans, the French Quarter was largely untouched because it's just a few feet higher in elevation than the surrounding area. And so it survived. So the French Quarter is extremely historic. You can go down there and still go to the area where slave markets were in the 17 and 1800s. And as our country was developing, this place became kind of like a pirate's cove. A lot of nefarious stuff was going on. And one of the way they give all these explanations when you're there about how the vampire myth started there. And another way that they say is that there was disparity between the number of men and women in New Orleans during the frontier days. And so they imported all these women from Europe, but these weren't like ladies of high class. They were, basically what the European countries and England wanted to get rid of. And so they shipped, these prostitutes and these people who were maybe in trouble for debtor's prison or whatever. They shipped all these women over and they stayed in convents. And they were bringing them over to kind of balance out the man-woman population over there so that people could start families. And they shipped all of their things over because it was the cheapest way to do it in wooden coffins. And so all these coffins arrived strangely in New Orleans.
Wow.
And went to these convents, and they were like, why are they importing all these coffins? Okay. And so that's just one story you'll hear about the rumors of vampires in New Orleans. And so, but that's true. That's a true story. They did ship all their stuff over in coffins and stuff. So one of the rumors was like, maybe there's fucking vampires in those coffins.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden you have all these crazy vampire stories. The French Quarter is so historic that they say an average of 7 people have died in each room of the buildings in the French Quarter. You know, that's how old the buildings there are, and how much violence there's been in the area.
Wow.
So if you look into like Dauphine LaLaurie or, you know, Madame LaLaurie or any of the really crazy histories of New Orleans, of like just kind of sadomasochistic demon people going down there and like doing horrible things. People they'd like to get, and then of course you have the Haitian influence right there from Haiti coming in, creating, and then there's a lot of voodoo, and to this day there's a lot of voodoo stores and voodoo and that influence from the slave trade coming over from Haiti. It really influenced the dark underbelly of the tone of the city. The first time I ever went to New Orleans, this is a true story. This is a true story. I was a guide throughout North America for over a decade, and I would take people around the country for a company that is now out of business because of COVID, because we can't do group travel anymore. But these kids were kids from all over the world who wanted to come backpack America. And so this company had rented a bunch of 15-passenger vans, and they hired young kids like me to drive these European, Asian, you know, Scandinavian, everywhere from around the world, all these kids around America. When we went to New Orleans, we would always have a pretty crazy time. I would try to get them a tour of all the different things. We would take a ghost tour. We would take we'd go down and get some beignets. But the history of New Orleans, you know, it's a little overwhelming for people. It just had a completely different tone than the rest of the trip. It was like, okay, now we're going to go to a real life haunted house. And people still think it's haunted. They still tell crazy stories here. And this is a true story. The first time I went there, it had been less than 2 years since a computer executive, I'm pretty sure he was from Microsoft, but I'm not sure what, they were having a big computer conference. And he had heard about these underground vampire bars. Now, this is in the late 90s, early 2000s. He had heard about these underground vampire bars. And he said, oh, I'm going to go check these out. And so he had his whoever, cabbie, whatever, somebody was like, okay, we'll go check this particular one out. Well, he ended up meeting a group of women in this underground vampire bar, and he invited them back to his presidential suite where he had a hot tub. And you can look this up. This is a true story that happened in New Orleans. They proceeded to get drunk with champagne in his hot tub with him. And then eventually they hit him over the head with the champagne bottle and cut his neck. And they all ritually drank his blood, you know, and it's on like the security cameras from the room.
What? Wow. So they captured.
And this happened in like the early 2000s.
Oh my God. So they saw it on CCTV kind of a camera.
I don't know how much was actually visible. You know, you hear these stories and you read the media reports and you have to kind of piece things together for yourself. I'm not sure that the actual murder was on video, but it may have been the way they were speaking of it.
But it was part of
because they knew exactly. Apparently these girls were in a cult, like a vampire cult. Yeah. And it was common in this time to like draw blood with syringes and be like, I'm a vampire. But I mean, who knows? Maybe they were caught and prosecuted, you know?
Yeah, and that's an interesting one in itself, because I feel like there are some people who claim that I think they're just humans who like want to be vampires for some bizarre reason.
Sure. Well.
And and you hear about them as well, you know, where they feel like, oh, they crave blood, but they're just human people who have some sort of a deficiency of some description, or they just want to be vampires. And I feel like there are two categories of beings. There are humans just who are in that category, and then I think there are actual vampires, and I think they are probably the ones.
It's hard to know what these people were, because like if you follow that story through, like some of them were acquitted. It gets real weird and fishy, and like the girl who did it only serves like 2 years, and you're like, well, is that because she has some incredible generational wealth and she really is a vampire and she just had millions of dollars that she saved up over the years to be like, yeah, this is what I do, so I'll serve 2 years, I don't care, I'm immortal, like big deal, and this was fun, you know what I mean? So if you really look into the story, it's fascinating. It's hard to know because they went through with it, and that dude disappeared, you know, they did drink his blood. So
they all acquitted. They were all didn't have to go to jail.
Two of the girls were acquitted. Like I can't remember the exact details. You'd have to Google it, but I remember doing my research on it, and back in the day when I researched it, it was like, yeah, they were at a computer conference. This dude went out and tried to find a vampire bar and ended up getting murdered.
Wow, it sounds like something from that TV show called True Blood. You know, where there's a bar and cafe.
Yeah.
A bar where they go for vampire.
Well, I mean, like I think that's kind of like taken from that story, for sure.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because it's hard to know if they were real ones, because they could be just as easily as they could just be humans who want to be. But yeah, if only we could. But I do think that the real vampires, because if they're walking just amongst us incognito, they'll probably try not to attract attention to themselves. But then maybe every now and then they just kind of lose control and things happen and it gets in the news and they're like, oh, okay, next time don't do that.
Or maybe they don't even care. They're just like, what? I don't care what the rats think of me with their stupid television programs. Like, what are they going to put me in a box? I'll just wait. You guys are all going to die and I won't. So, if you were immortal, you'd have a completely different sense of time. You'd be like, well, whatever, as long as I'm not bored and you don't put a stake in my heart or whatever it is, I can wait you out. And it's not that necessarily that they would want to, it's that they would sit and lie in wait until the perfect opportunity, and then they would take advantage of it in such a way that was like so befuddling that there wouldn't even be, you may not even ever hear about it again.
I think for like
that's what people don't think about, how these things play out.
Yeah, I think so. I think for like humans are so used to dismissing the fantastical that if we hear something like that, we immediately assume that the most boring explanation is the correct one. But and probably they take advantage of that or can take advantage of that. But like, I think just like the show in True Blood, the TV show, they have vampires who are sort of really sort of, like the vegetarian variety, and they try not to attract attention to themselves. And there are others who are like, oh my God, humans are just these, dumb, blood bags or something. Like they have no.
Well, if you remember Brad Pitt's character in Interview with a Vampire, for a while he tried to go around eating chickens and rats, and he's like, I'll just substitute with other animals that have blood. But they were inferior for whatever reason. They tasted different and they just didn't serve him. It's not outside the realm of possibility to think about this creature, by the way.
Vampires, I do believe, are a species in their own right. And just like other beings who are also, different from humanity, I think they do perhaps live amongst us and we just don't know about them. And it's interesting because, when you mentioned, so Interview with a Vampire is obviously a fiction novel written by an author called Anne Rice. And, I watched her interviews and she kind of looks like a vampire herself. So I wonder.
She's creepy, for sure.
Well, not as creepy, but I could totally see her that she's kind of drawn to that. And I wonder if she actually channeled that book, or it came to her from, or inspired from something she really encountered herself. And the reason I say that is because here is an example of something that's definitely true. And that is, the books Twilight, they were written by Stephenie Meyers. So in watching Stephenie Meyers interviews, she's mentioned in several of her interviews, where even one with Oprah, that, she had the genesis of the idea for that book was from a dream that she had that was very vivid. And it was basically, the dream was she saw a human girl and a vampire boy in a meadow and they were talking to each other. Okay. So I don't know if you've heard of this, but she said that. Okay?
Just the idea. I'm sorry. As soon as you said like she was on Oprah and she was telling, she came up with Twilight. Here's what I heard in my head. And they were like, he was shimmering and they were like just in a field and they were like boning and he was a million years old but pretending to be a 17-year-old. And she was underage. I mean, if you look at that there's details to that series that have real problems. I mean, we're talking about a kid who got locked into being 17, but he's hundreds of years old. It's all cute to talk about vampires and everything, but there's like many layers to that series, particularly, especially when you note that she doesn't follow the standard rules that we've always associated with vampires. She kind of created her own. They just sparkle or whatever.
I know. Well, I've got something to add to that. So with her book, she said, okay, she said that she had that dream. So she started that book, and the book sort of wrote itself. Like the characters were actually talking to her as she was writing it, which also suggests it's sort of a channeled book. But then in one of her separate interviews later on, because I think she wrote the first book and then they made the movie, and then she wrote the other books. And there was
interesting.
Yeah, and then in the other books when she was writing them, I think they made the first movie. It went, it was a phenomena. It was very famous. And then she had another interview where she was, I think it's a YouTube show that's called Unscripted with the actual stars of a movie, and they just sort of talk, answer questions from the audience or people who write in. And anyway, so she had Kristen Stewart, what's his name, Robert Pattinson, yeah,
Robert Pattinson, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and Stephenie Meyers, they were in an interview together, and she said in that interview that when she was writing the second book, she had another dream, because they asked her, I said, "Oh, did you ever have another dream about that whole story?" And she said, "Actually, I did." And in that dream, Edward, the vampire, came to her. And he said to her, "What you've written about me is wrong, in the sense of that he doesn't eat animals. He, as in a drink from animals. He actually is just like any other vampire. He has the same needs, for human blood, etc." And she said that he seems.
Oh, forgive me. I never saw the original movie. In the movie, he doesn't choose to prey on people.
And so, in the movie, they show that he's one of those kind of like Brad Pitt of Interview with a Vampire, that he hates.
Yeah, they can't. So he rejects the basic laws of his existence.
Yes,
his own existence. He sort of rejects them.
Exactly, okay. Especially because he didn't choose it happened to him, and he doesn't. So he has a real moral conflict within himself. So he only kills animals to survive. Okay, so he's a sort of like a vegetarian vampire in that sense. So in that interview, she was saying that Edward, that vampire played by Robert Pattinson, came to her in a dream, said, you written me incorrectly in your book, and he seemed really angry about it. And she said that she felt like he was going to attack her or something. And she felt like, so something like that. And then she woke up and she was quite sort of scared about it. I thought that was really interesting, because I think she did change the story to suit her ethics and what she felt comfortable with.
Bitch sounds like a psycho. Who knows? Maybe she did channel a real vampire. It's totally possible, But I mean, what's more likely is that vampires are extremely intoxicating, and one of the things that they do say about them is that they can. One of the things that, if you actually do research vampires, they say that they can communicate without speaking with you.
Yes,
they can communicate with ESP.
Yeah.
So the idea that she channeled him, that's congruent. It's just not, when you watch that series, you realize it's garbage. And when you watch Interview with a Vampire, you're like, I'm afraid to go outside at night now. There's a kind of congruence with reality, which is so strong. And you see that woman's presence and the way she presents herself, and she's not like, vampires told me this. She's just like, yeah, whatever.
No, but actually,
and you're just like, okay, she, those two books, those two books have such a different presentation to me. One has a resonance of potential truth in a time where that was all about that truth, and the second is a confabulation of a lot of nonsense. And that's just my opinion, but the tone of both of those is very different. And I could care less about the second, but the first one still is intriguing. And
no, it's beautiful.
It's a little too specific in terms of human interaction. And because what the real beauty about Interview with a Vampire is the struggle that they have with each other, because we are all in struggles and we can identify with that. And that's what makes us go, oh, we should maybe think about this, because our struggle is not dissimilar. And if I could elaborate on it just a second, this is pretty cool. I know a lot of people in our society who want to be vegetarians because they don't like the idea that the most healthy food they can eat is meat, aside from the fact that they happen to be made of meat. Okay. And it's like, what's efficient? You're made of meat. So if you eat meat, your body takes it apart and it puts it back together into you. If you eat plants, it takes plants apart. It has to do all this magic, switch it into stuff. It's fine if you want to be a vegetarian. I was a vegetarian for 8 years, but I don't think that's the most efficient component of nutrition. And I don't think it's nice that the world set us up in a paradigm where we have to kill animals in order to be the most healthy we can be. But that's how it is. And I think vampires feel that same way. They're like, well, I really don't like this necessarily. Some of them are like, well, that's just how it is. Unfortunately, if I was a vampire, I'd probably be like, well, I feel bad for these humans, but they're delicious. Because I do that with cows. And it's not that I disrespect the cows or the turkeys or whatever animal I happen to be ingesting. I think it's super important to pay that animal all the dignity. Yeah.
Okay, so maybe we should get to some of the things that I had listed here, circling back to Saint Germain, but I'll just quickly say
something. Oh, yeah. Feel free to cut out whatever you want. I don't care. Keep the narrative however you want.
Yeah, no, that's okay, because I'm doing it for the first time, so I really don't know what I'm doing. So I'm just, doing what I think will sound okay. But yeah, so I'll have no idea until I listen back to it. And hopefully I made sense, and you made perfect sense. So you're a pro at this, I can tell. It's as long as it flows, I think that's the main thing. And so just quickly about the being vegetarian and non-vegetarian, I do have a theory on that, actually. I know it's a bit of a tangent from Saint Germain, but I feel like there's been a lot of push in the last few years for people to become vegan, not even vegetarian, vegan.
Oh yeah.
And I feel like there's a real agenda behind that. Like
for sure.
Yeah, and you covered part of it as well before the screen froze. But so part of the agenda is obviously, like you were saying, it's easy for them to alter, genetically modify plants, so that's what we're ingesting. But I think there's another reason as well, and I think the other reason is that this is just something I've always thought about, noticed in the past as well, that cultures that eat meat, they tend to be more aggressive by nature, because they usually come from landscapes where not enough food, vegetarian food grows. So they have to kill animals to survive, to eat. And they tend to be the really people who live in rugged areas. They're very masculine, the alpha male. And I feel like they're trying to reduce the alpha male part of our species so that they can control us more easily.
Well, that's absolutely true. That's absolutely true. One of the things that they say in esoteric mystery schools about nutrition is that the agrarian revolution was the death of the brain. So, when we started growing corn, wheat, bread and circus is very real. If you feed the masses bad food, they become dumb. Your body is not made of grain. It's made of fat. And so your brain specifically is 80% fat. And in order to, fuel that organ, you have to intake a lot of fat. And not just fat, you have to be super well hydrated. You have to have the correct amount of salt in your body so that the electrical systems can work. Yeah. All these things, you've heard narratives about them being negative. I don't know how old you are, but I'm 42. And so I remember in the 80s where they were saying salt caused heart disease. Well, salt doesn't cause heart disease. Actually, your body has to have salt in order for its electrical system to work. And the idea that you would want to reduce a person's salt content in their body, what that does is it short circuits your electrical system. So you just can't operate as well. Disease develops. The same thing happens when you reduce its access to fats or its access to, it used to be super common to take an entire animal like a chicken or a squirrel or something and put it in a pot and boil it down. And because we don't do that, we don't have as much of the connective tissue. So we have weak joints now, and we have all these inflammation issues with our joints because we're not eating cartilage anymore, because you have to boil down cartilage for a long time in soups and in stocks, and then people just don't make those kinds of things anymore. Yeah. These agendas with food, they're all about control and about removing optimization. They're about interrupting optimization. So if you flood the body with sugar, it becomes diabetic and it releases massive amounts of cortisol, which in turn ends up with in massive amounts of systemic inflammation. That's what diabetes is, and diabetes is a disease of of the diet, completely. And I know diabetics who could become carnivores and literally divest themselves of the disease, but instead they'd rather eat a cookie and put a shot in their arm. And I can't understand that at all. But these narratives about beyond meat and all these things, this is just Maverick's opinion, they're definitely engineered either to make money or to, and the reason that they get popularized and that they're allowed to become so big, because there are there are portals and there are thresholds where people simply aren't going to invest in your product or like whatever. People do have agendas. And one of the biggest agendas is the pharmaceutical industry. And if people are sick and tired and not feeling their best, they can be sold drugs, and that's food is a drug. Food is the most important drug. I'm not a doctor, but I will say that in my opinion, there's nothing more important than what you eat, and if you think that you can eat something other than what you are, and that's the most efficient way. I'm not saying it's positive. I'm not saying it's nice. I'm not saying it's fun. I'm not saying it's neat. I think it's uncomfortable in the human condition to have to eat meat and to have to know that you're locked into a system where the most efficient replenishment of your nutrients comes from pretty much another identical thing. Like if we started eating people, it'd probably be the most efficient, but thank goodness we have an ethical boundary there. And so like the next best thing is like a very healthy, energetic, red-blooded animal. It's that simple. It's not magic. And the idea that you have so much abundance where you can just pick and choose and just eat beans and rice and all this other stuff. I'm just going to choose all these other things. That's fine. But there's going to be a massive deficiency and gap in what is optimal and what could be the best for the human condition. And guess what? The elites, the people at the top, the people who have no emotional game to be played, they don't care. They just want what's most efficient. And if it is people, those people will, who knows what they'll do. And that's where it gets scary. And what's the difference between that and vampires?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's a quite a big topic, and it is very close to my heart as well, because I do feel like what you are what you eat, like they say. So it affects you on so many levels that you can't even imagine. So, well, since we are circling back to vampires and all things Saint Germain, one of the very interesting things I think anyone can go and research on the internet is somebody called was he from the 1970s, Maverick?
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people don't know about that, but it completely blows your mind that video even exists that I'm talking about.
Well, there's so many cool ones actually of this guy when you go down the rabbit hole. Yeah. He was a famous guy. He identified as Saint Germain in the 1970s. He came out of nowhere. He had a lot of money, obviously. He knew some things about alchemy. He did some very real magic with metal on camera with scientists, to demonstrate he could turn things into gold and manipulate different metals. And what's really amazing is that he all of a sudden died a couple of years later in mysterious circumstances, like in I don't know, the Bahamas or Saint Tropez or something. But it fits into the same narrative where if you're this immortal person, you're going to show up, you're going to do some cool stuff, you're going to inspire people, and then you're going to disappear. And it might have been that in this particular instance, the most effective means to manage his disappearance was to fake his own death. And that's what I think happened, because all that was left was a note. They never found a body. It was just like, come on, man. I mean, what is this? So when you really look into it, it's very fishy, and it's fascinating because on camera, he's hysterical. He's impressive. He's very funny.
It's amazing. I'm just looking up the video, so I'll bring it up in a second. But it's like, when I discovered it for the first time, I'm like, what? Like, wait, this actually exists on the internet.
Dans toutes les périodes de sa vie. Je me suis vu riche, très riche. Je me suis vu pauvre. Je me suis vu en prison.
Let me see if I can...
Oh, your subtitles are in Spanish. You gotta switch those.
Yeah, just change.
Yangees. English. Uh-oh. Yeah, but you see this, what's happening right here? I'd like to comment on this. The fact that only French subtitles are available, that's not a mistake. They're trying to obfuscate this knowledge, and because it's not something that's that important,
Je l'ai égaré.
Yeah.
You know, because it's something that's not that important. They're like, whatever, no one's really going to get this. But like, they have deleted all the good files on this guy since I even talked about him.
Actually, that's interesting.
And
I saw something, a video that was 22 minutes long. It's actually gone now. That was just like a year ago. Yeah. Sorry. Go on.
So like since I went down my rabbit hole, and when I did the podcast on Sam Tripoli's show, half those videos had disappeared, and then it seems like now, you know,
subtitles that I could listen to. But it's interesting because there's that video of where he's doing the lead into. Is that it? Do you think?
No, just
I'll go back further. I don't know.
Now this dude's making an example. It's perfectly legitimate, and anyone who knows alchemy can see what he's doing. It's not magic. It's very straightforward, you know. But
so you see, so I've just skipped.
Yeah, I mean,
he says that he's one of the Templars. Did you know that? He says that he's one of the Knights of Templars. He knows that now we are there. We're still for people who are initiated into.
Random dude shows up. He's like, I can turn lead into gold, and I'm gonna date this woman now. Then he releases a single with her, okay, singing, because he's a musician. He's a lifelong musician. He sings a single with her, and it goes to like platinum, whatever, in the records. And then they have some really weird fallout, and then he's dead. A couple years later. So it's like, it's just, he's the weirdest character, but the fact that he dates aristocracy, you know, immediately embeds himself in the highest of society, and is extremely wealthy. He, you know, everything's congruent with the other Saint Germains. You know?
It's amazing. I think he's a really good con artist.
And all of a sudden this dude shows up with the same name, and he's cavorting with the most obscenely famous people. Like, yeah, maybe that was a faker, but like, he definitely has to have some game to get in there. Like, do you think that those kind of people just let any Johnny come lately into their court? No, of course not. You know? Yeah,
definitely. And sorry, I think my laptop's about to run out of battery. I just noticed.
Well, that's okay. This is I actually don't have that much time left, but
so maybe we can end it here. I just thankfully I've noticed it. Otherwise, it would just abruptly shut down. So this is so interesting.
Well, I hope you got some good content.
I really did. There's so many things, like you're so easy to talk to, and there's so many subjects.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, no, seriously. I feel like I could just chatting with a friend. You made it so easy and comfortable, and hopefully this won't be the last one, and I'll get to talk to you again. So,
yeah, please. Like, my door is open, and if anybody wants to reach out to me and connect to me and ask me questions, whatever, I'm no fucking expert. I'm just a guy who, I consider myself to be a non-academic historian. In other words, I go down these history rabbit holes. I now have the same resources as any academic professor, and sometimes, in many cases, more so. The only thing that I don't have access to are private libraries. And that is something that's literally what you're going to end up paying for in the future, in my opinion, in academia. You're going to be paying for access to these private bodies of knowledge. And so none of us have those really until we connect with each other and find them. I do have a lot of books that are out of print. I try to get everything in paper and read it so that it can't be changed. It's important for us to preserve ideas like Saint Germain the way that they are historically, because we can't have people saying that he didn't exist. I mean, this person appears in the journals of the most famous people in the 17 and 1800s as their friend, not as some random guy who showed up, but as a confidant, a person who gave them good advice, a person who was there and trying to help and sweet, overwhelmingly positive, and it's interesting to speculate on why he was that way, but he definitely did a lot of things that were interesting, and we have to at least preserve what we have, because right now it's very gray and very like, who was this guy? But we definitely know he existed. We definitely know he was older than the average lifespan of a human being that we know, and we have proof of that. So
no, I think he's endlessly
just in that one incarnation, just in the son of the Duke of Rákóczi, the last heir of Transylvania. There's just that one narrative. That person's life was longer than, it was almost 200 years. So just that alone is fascinating.
Yeah, and it's worth that deep dive and really trying to research it. And I'm so grateful that I got to talk to you about it today. And so Maverick, let the listeners know where they can find you, and I'll link everything below. And if anyone, so really, thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure, man. And if you want to find me, I'm at maverickmatthews.com. I'm not on any social media anymore. I need to make that really clear because I'm afraid of avatars and bots and things popping up, that represent me. I do not do any social media, anything like that. So maverickmatthews.com is where I'm at. There's nothing fancy there. I really don't like having to have an internet presence. And so it's kind of ironic. If you actually log onto my website, that website's meant to be ironic and fun and silly. And you can tell by the picture that you land on that I'm kind of having fun with it. But it's a necessary evil. We have to connect with each other. And so I feel really grateful to be making the rounds of these podcasts. And I wish your podcast the best. I hope it takes off. And I hope you get some cool guests in the future.
Yes, well, I started with the coolest guest I could imagine. So thank you. So I think I'm on a good start. Thank you so much again. And I hope that you'll come back.
Oh, anytime. Just let me know. I appreciate it.
Sounds good. All right. I will end it now. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you soon. Bye. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. It was so nice to talk to Maverick. As you can tell, he's such a lovely human being, and it was just an absolute pleasure and delight, and just so easy to talk to him. Such an easy person to talk to, and with so much information as well. I feel like he's such a deep thinker and really has some beautiful, deeply felt and thought through ideas about life and our place in the universe. So if you did enjoy that, please do check him out on his website, www.maverickmatthews.com. And also, if you're interested in following up with any of the people that were mentioned in context of Saint Germain today, especially Richard Chamfray, the French gentleman who claimed to be Saint Germain in the 1970s, check him out. I'll provide some links below. And also, if you want to follow up on Dalida, the famous record-breaking, super rich singer and musician of all time in France, I will provide some links to her as well. It's a very interesting tale. If you look up their information on the internet, there's tons of information on YouTube and the internet as well. So have a look, have fun, enjoy. It's an exercise in expanding our imagination and wondering what ifs of life. What if he was an ascended master? What if he was a vampire but who was well-intentioned? And just like all human beings, we have our flaws. He was not perfect, but he was also a person who was a being that was trying to contribute in a positive way to humanity. So have a look. I hope you enjoyed the episode. I completely enjoyed it. It's my first podcast, and I could not have asked for a better guest. So thank you, Maverick. You are eternally, eternally appreciated. You are a genuinely kind and beautiful human being, and I'm just lucky to have had this connection made through this podcast. So for all of you, thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next episode. Bye for now.